So, now that we've added all the diatonic extensions to the basic shapes for major 7, dominant 7 and minor 7 chords, and we've looked at what happens when we add the 4th note and the 6th note, it's time to look at altered extensions, where these additional notes have been flattened or sharpened. There are various reasons to alter extensions, but it boils down to colour, the flavour it gives to the chord, and the function. That is how the chord is used, how it relates to the chords around it. Now, I'm not going to go into the theory here because we'd be here all day, but I'm also not going to go into every last possibility. Certain alterations are very common, some not so. And I'm going to focus on the ones you're more likely to encounter. First, though, let's take a look at the way these extensions are arranged above our shell voicings, starting with the 6th string shape. Aside from the diatonic extensions we've already seen, there are several alterations within easy reach of our shell voicing. Now, I just want to point out something worth bearing in mind. A few of these additional notes can have 2 different names. We've already seen how the 4 and the 11 are the same note, and likewise the 6 and the 13 are the same note. And the flattened 5th, for example, could also be the sharp 11. They're the same note, and the way you name it depends on the way the chord is built and the context it's used in, but of course the sound is exactly the same either way. The other main note that could be called 2 different things is the one I've shown as the sharp 5. This could also be called a flat 13. So if you see a G7 flat 13 chord, you can play a G7 sharp 5 chord. For now, you really don't need to worry about when you might call it by one name and when you might call it by another, but it is worth understanding that these alternative names exist. Here are some of the more common ways to incorporate these extensions. Here's a G7 flat 5. This has a very particular sound. You'll hear this chord type in Take the A Train, for example. Or at the beginning of Desafinado. Just out of interest, and something to investigate if you're curious, but if you were to move this shape up 6 frets, that would be D flat 7 flat 5, and you're actually playing the same notes in a different order. Of course, although I'm calling this chord a 7 flat 5, it could just as easily be a 7 sharp 11. The shape is the same for either chord. But G7 flat 5 has the same notes as the same chord half an octave away. Okay, moving up the 2nd string, let's sharpen that 5th now. Here's G7 sharp 5. You'll also see this called G7 augmented, which might be written as aug or as a plus symbol, and as I mentioned just now, it could be G7 flat 13 too. You'd hear this chord at the start of Stormy Weather. Don't know why there's no sun up in the sky, stormy weather, since my gal and I ain't together. On the top string, the 2 altered extensions are the flat 9 and the sharp 9. You can play G7 flat 9 this way, with a bar. This chord is heard all the time in minor keys, where it's maybe the commonest way to play a dominant chord. Here it is in My Funny Valentine, for example, where it leads back to the minor chord 1. My funny Valentine, sweet comic Valentine, you make me smile with your heart. If you notice, the top part of the chord creates a diminished shape, and in jazz it's very common to use that diminished chord to stand in for a dominant flat 9 chord. Some of the shapes I'm giving you are a bit clunky, and that's because we're always playing the root of the chord. But of course, if you were playing with a bass player, say, or maybe another guitarist, you might want to avoid playing the root. So a diminished shape like this is the perfect choice to stand in for a G7 flat 9 chord. Oh, and before we leave the flat 9, try this. We can combine it with the flat 13 on the 2nd string. You could call this G7 flat 9 flat 13, but once you have a couple of altered extensions, you'll normally just see this written as G7 altered. An altered dominant is one that contains any altered extension, so flat 5, sharp 5, flat 9, or sharp 9, and doesn't have any diatonic extensions. I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but if you research the altered scale, you'll see that an altered dominant chord is one that fits entirely within it. Okay, the other altered extension that we haven't played yet is the sharp 9. And I reckon you'll want to move the 7 up an octave to create a more sensible shape. But it's still a stretch, and again the difficulty is because we're still playing the root of the chord, which literally anchors us to the bottom string. In fact, you could just move the root up an octave too. Now we've broken free of our original shell voicing, but that's all good since we're exploring and expanding our understanding of the fretboard. I'll give you a better example of the 7 sharp 9 in action when we look at the 5th string shapes very shortly. Some of those altered extensions are easier to deal with than others, of course. By now you'll have got the idea that when we're playing the 6th string shell voicing, the 9th is on the top string and the 13th is on the 2nd string, which is obviously where you'll find the flat 13 or sharp 5 and the flat 5 and sharp 11 too. But that's reversed for the 5th string voicing. Playing chords with the root on the 5th string puts the 9th on the 2nd string, and all that other stuff is up on the top string. Moving to C7 then, you can see the way the extensions are laid out. Now the flat 9 and sharp 9 are in easy reach. C7 flat 9 is a really common shape, a little bit less cumbersome than the equivalent shape for the 6th string voicing we just looked at. And if you add the 5th of the chord on the 1st string, you can see that diminished chord appearing on the top 4 strings again. Here's G7 flat 9 with a diminished shape on top, and now C7 flat 9, again with that diminished shape floating above the root. As for the sharp 9, again it's a very popular shape, and you might hear it in funk and soul, and it's really famous up here as E7 sharp 9 from Hendrix's Purple Haze. So much so that some people call it the Hendrix chord. Now, both the flat 9 and the sharp 9 on the 2nd string can be combined with flat 5 and sharp 5 to create various altered shapes. Here's C7 sharp 9 with a flat 5, for example, or C7 sharp 9 sharp 5. Dominant chords are really where the action is when it comes to altered extensions, but there are a couple of really important shapes for major 7 and minor 7 chords with alterations, and they both revolve around the flattened 5th or sharp 11. Let's take a look. For a major 7 chord, you'll often want to include a sharp 11. It's the 11 you naturally get if you extend the chord as if it were on the 4th step of a scale. So for instance, if we were to play G major 7 as if it were chord 4 in D major, you'll find the 11 is C sharp. In that sense, it's actually a diatonic extension. Anyway, according to all the maps we already have, it's really easy to play as a 6th string shape. And for a 5th string shape, let's have C major 7. Adding the sharp 11 means barring across the top string on the 2nd fret, but of course you'll want to do something with the 2nd string, so the natural 9th might pop in there. Again, this is a bit involved, but that's because we're playing the root and that limits our movement. Now that same note, the sharp 11, but now called a flat 5, is included as part of a minor 7 flat 5, also known as a half diminished chord. In this chord type, that note is the actual 5th of the chord, not an extension. For the 6th string shell voicing, let's look at A minor 7, here on the 5th fret, where the 5th of the chord is on the 5th fret of the 2nd string. We could just lower that a fret like this to make a very standard minor 7 flat 5 shape. For the 5th string shape, well, we need a bit of housekeeping. Here's our basic D minor 7, and if we move the 3rd up an octave, like this, then that flat 5 is available here on the 4th string, and you might bar that. This is another really standard way to play this chord. You're bound to come across this chord in conjunction with a 7 flat 9 as a 2-5 progression in a minor key. So there you are. Minor 7 flat 5 on the 6th string and on the 5th string. Two really useful shapes to know and all connected to our original shell voicings. Oh, and in case you're curious about this stuff, looking at the A minor 7 flat 5 again, you can see the top bit is really just a C minor with an A in the bass. So it contains exactly the same notes as C minor 6. Likewise, D minor 7 flat 5 has the self-same notes as F minor 6. This is quite a good example of something that's pretty common when we're dealing with jazz chords, that depending on the inversion, by which I mean the order of the notes and which one is on the bottom, and depending on the purpose of the chord and the context it's played in, you'll often come across chords that can have more than one name. C6 and A minor 7, for example, are just the same notes rearranged. Watch out for this sort of thing because it happens a lot.